This will be a two-part series on immigration. In the first part, we will look at immigration from purely an analytical point of view. All my statements will be backed up with studies, and there will be a list of sources in the description. Part 2 will focus on actual immigration stories. The reality of immigration from an economic perspective is both good and bad. Without immigration, the United States would see little to no growth. An interesting case study on what would happen to an aging population if it keeps a eugenic immigration policy is Japan. Japan over the past years has seen little to no growth while their population has been steadily aging. According to Harvard sociologist Mary Brighton, an aging population will mean higher costs for the government, a shortage of pension and Social Security type funds, a shortage of care for the very aged, slow economic growth, and a shortage of young workers. This, among other things, is a reason for Japan's slowing economy. The United States has seen a similar decline in fertility rates. According to Business Insider, the United States is at an all-time low in fertility rates, 1.67, well below replacement level of 2.1. However, the United States has immigration to offset this. Immigration to the United States also helps increase population not only through the immigration itself, but through the next generation. According to Pew Research, immigrants and their descendants are projected to account for 88% of the U.S. population growth through 2065. This population growth helps stimulate the United States economy and avoid the pitfalls of an aging population. Some argue that immigration to the United States only benefits those who are already rich. This point has some merit. According to Harvard economist Jorge Borjas, wages for high school dropouts fell by 3 to 4% for each 10% increase in the share of immigrants. This can be partially attributed to the fact that a disproportionate amount of immigrants are high school dropouts. According to Roger Lowstein in an article titled The Immigration Equation, in 2017, immigrants were 3 times as likely as the U.S. born to have not completed high school, 27% versus 9%. This may seem like a large number of dropouts entering the United States. However, this number is highly inflated by those immigrating from Mexico. It is common not to graduate high school in Mexico. It is not the same indicator of future success as it is in the United States. This statistic brings up the point that those who are already facing hardship would face the most hardship from an increase in immigrants. Repeat studies have found a wage drop of only 1%, but that still means that there was a drop in wages when more immigrants came. As a counterpoint, I bring up an interesting study of what happens when an economy accepts a large amount of immigrants. Rachel Freiberg, an economist at Brown, studied what happened to wages as a mass of Russian immigrants came to Israel. She found the Russians had, if anything, improved the wages of native Israelis. She hypothesized that the immigrants competed more with one another than the natives. The Russians became garage mechanics, and the Israelis ran the garages. The principle runs that if there are more workers working, then there are more managers needed. The native population becomes those managers. Overall, when looking at what immigrants do to the health of an economy, it is a little divided but mostly positive. It keeps the aging population at bay, but brings down the wages for the lowest earning workers. However, it increased the wages for the other 90% of native-born workers. Policy on immigration should reflect that benefit. We must continue to accept the same amount of immigrants, if not more. In part 2, I will read excerpts from The Parent Who Stays, written by Reina Grande. "Go say hello to your father," my aunt says, pushing me towards him. All I wanted to do was run away. He hugged me too briefly, too hesitantly, and I realized that we were strangers to him too. This stranger had borrowed money from everyone he knew and hired a smuggler to take me and my siblings north. So, at the age of 9.5, I found myself at the U.S. border and became an illegal human being by crossing without permission for a chance to finally have a family. Border Patrol caught us twice and sent us back to Tijuana twice. It was a miracle that we made it the 3rd time, although my father had to carry me on his back most of the way. It was there at the U.S. border where I got my first piggyback ride from my father. My parents didn't leave Mexico, they fled. not for their lives, but for a life. The term economic refugee, a negative term here and in Europe, doesn't encourage compassion in the receiving country, either socially or politically. My childhood was defined by the fear of being forgotten or abandoned, of being replaced by US-born siblings. Due to the so-called war on drugs, Guerrero is now the most violent state in Mexico, which is the second most violent country in the world. In 2016, there were 23,000 homicides in Mexico, surpassed only by Syria. But our war, supported by the United States through millions of dollars in funding, training of soldiers, and provisions of aircraft, weapons, and vehicles to the Mexican government, isn't considered a real war, so Mexicans don't qualify for asylum. Unfortunately for us immigrants, the trauma doesn't end with the successful border crossing. I believe that for the rest of your life you carry that border inside of you. It becomes part of your psyche, your being, your identity. After so many years of separation, we didn't know each other. Though physically we had crossed the border, we had missed so many years of each other's lives that emotionally and psychologically, there was still a barrier between us. Immigration had turned my parents into strangers. The family I once knew in Mexico no longer existed. When I learned English at the expense of Spanish, language increased the separation. The day I started junior high, I surpassed my parents, who had only gone to elementary school, so my education further separated us. Our emotions became a barrier as well. I was the daughter they left behind, and for most of my life, my relationship with my parents was filtered through that lens. 30 years would pass, and I would become a mother, wife, and successful writer. Yet, when my father died in 2011, he was as much a stranger to me as he was when I first met him in my grandmother's house. It's the central irony of my life that my parents emigrated to try to save our family, but in doing so, they destroyed it. I know my experience isn't unique. 80% of immigrant children in the U.S. schools have been separated from their families during the process of immigration. My education in U.S. schools was almost as traumatic as being abandoned by my parents. When I started 5th grade in Los Angeles, language was a barrier. Because I spoke no English, I was put at a corner table and ignored by my teacher. I felt voiceless. I sat in that corner on the outside looking in, marginalized, excluded, othered. And yet, I know I was lucky. If I arrived at the border today seeking asylum, I would have the door slammed in my face. I would be told that I haven't suffered enough, that I should go back to my country and suffer more. Even if I was seeking refuge, I was not a refugee. 3 years ago, there was a surge in unaccompanied child migrants, most from Central America, who came seeking refuge from poverty, oppression, and violence created by criminal gangs. Their migration continues, though their arrival at the border is no longer in record numbers because the United States is now paying Mexico to catch and deport these children. But for the ones who do arrive in the United States, after all, the trauma they've endured in their countries and the long journey to the border, they're thrown into detention centers and forced to face federal immigration judges to plead their cases in court, often without legal representation. Despite psychological and emotional distress, I went to college and became the first in my family to get a university diploma. I became a teacher, a published author, a homeowner. I have won awards. I married a good man and have 2 beautiful children. I accomplished every goal I set for myself and have been more than lucky. What I do know is that if I were put in my father's place, I would do the same. I would risk everything for my children. I bear witness every day to the trauma of our loss, suffering wounds that will never heal. It's a price that I would pay 100 times over, because one of my father's greatest gifts to me, and indirectly to his grandchildren, is this. His decision to be an immigrant has allowed me to be the parent he could never be. Unlike him, I will never be a stranger to my children. I now get to be the parent who stays.